Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The one pleasant thing when Andre Beteille is opening the discussion, the subject matter of discussion is, I don't have to give an elaborate introduction. We all know his credentials, we know his work, we know his achievements. Andre, I first came in contact with him when he graciously agreed to deliver one of the Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lectures. And that lecture was called The Pursuit of Equality. In fact, that opened my eyes to various aspects of equality, which you don't get when reading Supreme Court judgments. The only one thing about this is Andre Beteille Omnibus. It should be called magnum opus. Not now. The three books brought in this magnum opus deal in their own way with the ideal of equality and its significance in our political and social life. As his remark, Panditji said, equality is the spirit of the age. Am I correct? That's what he said, yeah. Well, equality is also the signature tune of our Constitution. But the tune is not articulated in one key. There are different keys, different articulations, different instruments on which the key is played out. And especially the problems arises with regard to provisions for, you call them protective discrimination or compensatory discrimination or preferential treatment of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs. That's where most of the disputes in court have arisen, and that also sometimes leads to social tensions. I'm sorry to say, what's happening here? I'm sorry to say the Supreme Court judgments have not imparted clarity nor consistency of juristic thinking. And I'm sure if the Supreme Court had the benefit of Professor Andre Beteille's books, I think we would have had more well-reasoned and informed judgments. Well, I can't pretend, but he's done the whole thing in a thorough scholarly manner. That's the great merit of this. I'm going to call it magnum opus, not omnibus.
Magnum bogus, you said just now.
Did I? What a terrible slip of the tongue. Huh? Then we'll have to see what rhymes with bogus, hocus, pocus, bogus. So let's not go into it. Let's get the focus on the book. But I don't pretend, and I cannot pretend, I don't think how many of you have read the entire book. But the one essay which I found very stimulating is equality and universality. And the problem is well articulated in Isaiah Berlin's statement, which is quoted at page 205, and I'll read that. Equality is one value among many. The degree to which it is compatible with other ends depends on the concrete situation and cannot be deduced from general laws of any kind. It is neither more or less rational than any other ultimate principle. Indeed, it is difficult to see what is meant by considering it either rational or non-rational. And as Professor Beteille has well said, Berlin was by no means opposed to equality, but he believed that there were other ends that was just as compelling and that sometimes collided with it. And that's come the vexed problem which you have found in courts and otherwise, when people say, students, they don't know the history, they don't know the background. I got 95%, but I wasn't given admission because someone got 85% just because he happened to belong to that category. This apparent contradiction, inconsistency, sometimes if not explained away, breeds resentment and is the source of social tensions. Now, Professor Andre Beteille, I think I've said enough. He'll be introducing the book, if I may say so. And thereafter, we have very distinguished people who will be discussing it. We have Professor Dipankar Gupta to my right. And Professor Dipankar Gupta has earned a well-justified reputation as a sociologist and is deeply committed to objective inquiry into complexities of India's social structure. On our left is Professor Jodhka, I think a faculty member of the JNU, and his areas of specialization are sociology of development, social stratification, Dalit studies, religious minorities. And Professor Nandini Sundar, she is currently a professor and the chairperson of the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics. She has held visiting positions at Paris, Yale, Michigan, Cambridge, and Chandigarh universities. So, well, we have a very distinguished panel, and we start off with Professor Andre Beteille. Andre, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Soli. Well, the first thing that I would like to say is that this is not one book. It's a collection of 3 books, which have been published over a period of nearly 40 years. The first one was published in 1965, and the last one was published in 2003. That's nearly 40 years. Before I tell you what the omnibus contains, I would like to say just a few words on what it does not contain. It does not contain all the things that I have written. There are some very significant omissions. There was a period of time in which I became greatly interested in the study of agrarian social structure. I was elected to a Nehru Fellowship in 1968, and for 2 years I worked on the agrarian social structure, and I published a book called Studies in Agrarian Social Structure and various other papers. All of that is not included here. I mention this particularly because I think Professor Jodhka first took an interest in my work when he was himself engaged in the study of agrarian social structure. So that is not included. What is also not included is my other work, which deals with the nature of sociology as an intellectual discipline. In particular, a book called Sociology, Essays on Approach and Method. That is also not included. So there's 3 books, and these 3 books are very different from each other. The first book, called Caste, Class and Power, is a monograph. It's a case study of a single village in the Tanjore district of Tamil Nadu, based on fieldwork in 1962-63. And in the course of writing that book, I stumbled upon the significance of social inequality and a particular way of representing social inequality and the changes taking place in social inequality. Sorry. So, while working on the material and writing up the material, I realized that if you are to write about social inequality in a single village, obviously you cannot escape the importance of caste. So I described the caste structure and inequalities in the caste structure, but I also realized that there were other inequalities which arose from the distribution of land, the control, the ownership, control and use of land, and this is what I call the agrarian social structure. And there were also inequalities in the distribution of power. So I examined at the level of a single village the inequalities arising out of caste, the inequalities arising out of class, and the inequalities arising out of the distribution of power, and the changes taking place in these various aspects of inequality. So then I went on to examine on a larger canvas, this is a single village, on a larger canvas, inequalities of caste. And I spent 2 or 3 years doing that and published a book called Caste, Old and New, which deals with the inequalities of caste considered on a wider canvas. Because while I was engaged in this study, I mean, after all, the sociological understanding of a society is a collective enterprise. One doesn't depend entirely on one's own original fieldwork. There were many others who were doing this kind of study. So I depended on that, and I published a book called Caste, Old and New. Having put that aside, I decided that I would take up the agrarian social structure, the inequalities that arise from the ownership, control, and use of land, inequalities between landowners, tenants, sharecroppers, wage laborers, and how the system as a whole operates. Now, I go back to the Delhi School of Economics, where all of this work was being produced, and there were two major influences. The Delhi School of Economics, at that time, certainly the most eminent sociologist in the country, M.N. Srinivas, and he had been working on caste, so obviously my work was influenced by his work. But there's another person in the same institution who was a man of great influence, and that was K.N. Raj. And K.N. Raj was an economist with a great interest in class. And he would needle me from time to time and tell me that you anthropologists and sociologists, you're all obsessed with caste. Why don't you study the real contradictions and the real inequalities in Indian society which arise out of class? So I devoted a certain amount of time to the study of class, and I was determined to prove to Raj not only that the sociologist could study class, but that he could do it better than the economist. I don't know, it's my youthful vanity. And better than the economist in this sense that the economist studied, I thought at that time, mainly the distributional aspects of class, the distribution, whereas we were more interested in studying the relational aspects of it. How do landlords and tenants and sharecroppers and wage laborers, how do they constitute a system and interact with each other? So this kept me busy till the late 60s, 70s. Then I decided that I would move out and look at inequality in a wider perspective. That is, look at inequality not just in Indian society, but inequality in general, in a general and comparative perspective. So I did all of that. Having done that, I was struck more and more by the point that the chairman made about Pandit Nehru's famous observation in the discovery of India. And that observation is, the spirit of the age is in favor of equality, although practice denies it almost everywhere. This contradiction between the ideal of equality, which is inscribed in our constitution, and the practice of inequality, which is very pervasive in our society, that became my main preoccupation for the next 10 or 15 years. The contradiction between the ideal of equality and the practice of inequality, and the tensions between them, and how do these tensions work themselves out, particularly in various institutional spheres. If you have to run a university, you have to recognize that the university is an organization which brings into being its own inequalities. How do you justify those inequalities in a society which has adopted the principle of equality as its basic principle? To what extent can they be reconciled? So this is something that I continued with, and the idea of natural inequality, which is the second of the volumes included in this book, in fact deals with issues of this kind. It also contains 2 essays on the future of the backward classes. It contains an essay on the pursuit of equality and the Indian university. How far can one pursue equality, and how far can one achieve equality, given the fact that there are compulsions of organization which lead you to compromise with the inequalities in the distribution of power, inequalities in the distribution of status, and so on. And then I decided that I would move on from there. But, you know, I spent quite some time examining the contradiction between the ideal of equality and the practice of inequality. And as a sociologist, I was aware of the fact, and the study Caste, Class and Power reinforced my conviction, that inequality is not a simple thing. Inequality has more than one dimension. The economic dimension of class, the status dimension of caste, and the dimension of power. But all of this while, I'd taken it for granted that equality is just equality. It's a very simple thing. What one needed to do was to examine the different dimensions of inequality and the interrelations between these different dimensions. There was a time when I worked very closely with a colleague of mine who is now no more, Professor B. Shivaramaya, who was a professor of law in the university, and he invited me to address a seminar in the law faculty. And I presented my case very eloquently and talked about the dimensions of inequality and said that there is a contradiction between the practice of inequality and the ideal of equality. When one of the students in the audience asked me, "But how do you define equality?" And the more I tried to meet his question, the more confused I became. And I realized that I had taken for granted something which is quite complex. The ideal of equality is not simply in contradiction with the practice of inequality, but the ideal of equality itself is made up of components which have many tensions between them. And they're not only different strands, but there is a tension between these different strands. So I began to ask myself, well, equality of outcome and equality of opportunity, how do they relate to each other? And that sent me off on a number of questions, which ultimately led to the third book, which is Equality and Universality. And I realized that there is a tension not only between equality of opportunity and inequality of outcome, but there is a tension within the principle of equality of opportunity, because what do you mean by equality of opportunity? Do you mean formal equality of opportunity or substantive equality of opportunity? What actually do you? And I realized that we could carry the argument for equality up to a point and not beyond that point. And I realized that there was something else. And that's where the quotation from Isaiah Berlin comes in. Because I think Isaiah Berlin points to a very significant, that equality is a very important value, but there are other values as well. And most egalitarians write as if equality is not only a very important value, as if it is the only value, it's the sole value. And Isaiah Berlin, I think more than any other philosopher in our time, drew attention to the tensions and conflicts between equality and other values. But I was, in Equality and Universality, I was not pursuing so much the tension between equality and other values like liberty or efficiency. I was pursuing the question of the tensions within the concept of equality and within the concept of equality of opportunity. And then I felt that perhaps one must make a distinction between equality and universality, that it may be difficult, if not impossible, to meet all the requirements of equality defined in all the different ways. It may be more realistic to try to meet the objectives of universality. What do you mean by universality? By universality, I meant making available certain basic resources, facilities, rights, and capacities universally, without consideration of merit, without consideration of need. And this is something which is discussed in some detail here. For instance, if you look at education, and this will be my final point, if you look at education and access to education, about which so much is being said, I think it's quite obvious that the criteria for access to education change as you move from one level of the educational system to another. If you start with elementary education, I think that access to elementary education should be open to all without consideration of race, caste, creed, and gender. Fine. But I would add that it should be open to all also without consideration of merit, ability, or talent. That is what I mean by universality. You can't, when a parent is seeking admission for a child to elementary school, you can't say that this child is not bright enough and therefore you exclude him. So you grant access without consideration of race, caste, creed, and gender. You also grant access without consideration of ability, merit, talent. But when you move up in the system, when you move from elementary education to secondary education to undergraduate education to advanced education, certainly you should still say that access should be open without consideration of race, caste, creed, or gender. But can you also say that access to higher education should be open without consideration of ability, merit, or talent? And that is why my argument has been that we must put the emphasis on universality rather than equality. And I think that from the point of view of policy making, it is much more fruitful if we confine ourselves, if we focus our attention to universality. And that is the theme of the third book here, which is called Equality and Universality. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a brilliant exposition of 3 books within 12 minutes. Excellent, admirable. No, I think we'll take questions at the end. We'll start with other discussions. Now I request Professor Dipankar Gupta for his comments on the book and on what Professor Andre Beteille just said.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I've read every page of this book. It took me a lifetime. I didn't just read the relevant pages.
Really?
So I can discuss the books with some authority. And not only I think all of us here, and many of us here have been brought up on books of Professor Beteille. These 3, besides the others, there's been a staple diet for many, many years. And therefore, I think it's just as well the OUP has brought out an omnibus. And I often ask myself, why did it take so long for OUP to bring up this omnibus? It should have come out much earlier. Given the fact that Professor Beteille, I think for a sociologist, made Oxford University Press respectable by publishing his books there. And if many of us have since then wanted to publish Oxford University Press, it's because Professor Beteille published there before us. Had he gone to a fly-by-night, hole-in-the-wall printers and pamphleteers, we'd have gone there too. But I think Oxford University Press has taken far too long. It's come out much earlier. They've redeemed themselves somewhat by a very attractive cover. But this is one book you should not judge by the cover. Mr. Soli Sorabjee talked about Supreme Court judgments and the lack of clarity. Mr. Sorabjee, you don't know the kind of books that we have to read in sociology, you know. And Professor Beteille's books stand apart because they are so clear, limpid. And that is why his books have lasted the test of time. He's been through, his own scholarship, as he just mentioned to you, been through several phases. This book is, in a way, a quick snapshot of some of these phases he's been through. But, whether it's a newspaper article or it's an academic work or a heavy intellectual exercise, they're always so well written and so clear that you cannot say at the end of the day, I didn't understand what he said. You can say I didn't agree with him, but you can't say I didn't understand. And most of us, sociologists, I think, would rather take refuge in not being understood, than being disagreed with. Sociology, Professor Beteille told me long back, was a very tough subject. Most people think sociology is easy because we talk about caste, kinship, gender, everyday topics, things that happen in the kitchen and stuff like that. But sociology is a very difficult subject because to make sociology really work, you have to imagine, think afresh. You can't just go to the Reserve Bank of India bulletin, open a few pages and find some correlations. You can't go to a archives, dig up a file and write about it. You have to have a problem before you go to a village. You just can't go to a village. You have to have a problem. You just have to have a problem when you go to a factory, to a slum. And what do you do with all that data? You have to think of all that in advance. No one is there to hold your hand. The data doesn't automatically speak to you, doesn't give you a conclusion straight away or lead you in any one direction. You have to think things through. Unfortunately, when I was a student in Delhi School of Economics years ago, in 69, I think, 69, 71, yes. At that time, Professor Beteille was a Nehru Fellow. I think the first Nehru Fellow, if I'm not mistaken. And we were all very proud of the fact that someone from our department had received this honor. And I must also say that we took a great degree of delight in contradicting Professor Beteille because he was from the very beginning anti-utopian and we were all very utopian. And we wanted to, test our skills against Professor Beteille in absentia. Well, I made up for it somewhat when many years later I joined the D School as a faculty member. And that is when I really got to know him as a person. Earlier I knew him as an intellectual at a distance, a somewhat forbidding figure. But when I got to know him as a person, it was one of the most delightful experiences of my life. And sometimes people ask me, why did I leave D school soon after I joined it? I hate to tell them that's because Professor Beteille had retired, and the greatest attraction I had over there had gone with his retirement. I have said it before, I'll say it again, and I think all of us know about this, that in fairness and in truth, Professor Beteille, in his scholarship on India, with working on Indian material, has brought together sociologists from all over the world to bear witness and to lend gravitas to our studies in India and on India. He has not only brought Weber, I think he was the first man to bring Weber to India in a serious way. I'm not just saying a passing quotation here or there, but Weber's a serious input into Indian scholarship. That's his first book, Caste, Class and Power, which almost runs very close to Weber's famous essay on caste, class and party, status and party. His book, Caste, Class and Power, and it's a very Weberian book from one point of view, because he shows how these three are different axes of power. But what is more interesting about the book is the things that he says there in that book have been repeated by many of us much later, and some of us don't even know that he said it first. Because it is so well sort of metabolized within us. For example, if one were to say that, the way one thinks is because the way one lives, no one says Karl Marx said it first, because we all know it. If I say footnote Karl Marx, it looks stupid. But, when Professor Beteille talked about the Jajmani system giving way to monetization, for example, in villages, or that democracy was making a difference to the way in which the landed elite controlled a village, or that there is this constant tussle in the caste order between different castes. What are the Padhyachis saying, what are the Ahmadiyas saying? Not only that, the Thengalai and the Vatikalai, that too is a problem. And all of this was brought up front. In other words, your ritual status is not something which is given once and for all. It is something that people debate with, fight over, and it is this competitive arena where caste should be understood. But going back to the point he made about inequality, what I think is the most important point there is Professor Beteille's explication from the first book to the last, and all three of them are here, that differences are there, sure enough. And that's the way I read it. I may have read it wrong, but who cares, as long as you read it in the way you like it to be read. Differences are there, but the way in which differences are translated into inequality, that is where sociology comes in. The differences are everywhere. But this translation of differences into inequality, social inequality, makes it relevant for sociology, gives sociology a certain degree of valency that it rightfully possesses. In his other works, which I think are very significant, especially the later ones, and he didn't speak too much about them in his introduction, he ended by talking about the fact that there's universality, you have to have access to education and things like that. Not only health, not only education, but I think what he said also applies equally to health. And I would say these are what is known as public goods, or as economists might say, merit goods. But all of that actually leads to a big point he made, and he continues to make through all these debates on public policy, and that is about institutional well-being. That yes, certain things are needed and required, there are certain good things to be done, but please don't forget that institutions have their own requirements, and those requirements should be looked after, nursed, and tended to. If you don't do that, then all your other good intentions will come to naught. But I don't quite understand why this particular point of view is so difficult to drive home in the realm of public policy. All right, you might say equality is very difficult to figure out in terms of its actual nuts and bolts. But if we were to go, and I'm taking leave from Isaiah Berlin and going on to another author that I was introduced to by Professor Beteille, and that's T.H. Marshall, then that difficulty kind of dissolves. And Marshall, incidentally, is quoted very lavishly in Professor Beteille's book, and I agree with what he said, and I think that I'm lucky that I read those portions with some degree of care. That is, equality in our world, everything is contextual. In our world, and our possible future world, equality means a lot only if it is linked with the notion of citizenship. And citizenship means a lot only if it's linked to the notion of democracy. And when Marshall said that citizenship is a status of equality that is bestowed on everybody, upon which the structures of inequality can be built, I think the whole matter falls in place beautifully. I have no problems at all. I have no puzzles. I have no tensions. I was introduced to, not just to Marshall, I was also introduced to Professor John Rawls through Beteille's works. And though Professor Beteille is at heart an anti-utopian, I think he's also a very engaged scholar in terms of relevant sociology, because he always wrestles with policy. And policy not from a policy perspective, but policy in terms of theory and the impact it has on knowledge in general. If Nehru said that about spirit of Indian society, inequality and equality, I would say in sociology, the spirit everywhere is towards universality, but the substance and the practice of it is towards exoticas. We tend to exoticize things. And Professor Beteille, the one point in which he bristles with rage is when he discusses how we learned about equality actually through the practice of inequality imposed on us by British colonial authorities. So I won't say any more right now. I'll leave it to the other speakers to take on. And later on, of course, we'll have question and answers. And this is Professor Beteille's evening, not ours.
Thank you very much, Dipankar. I may just mention one thing because I may have to leave at 7:30. It happens to the Parsi New Year. And if I not go there, they'll excommunicate me. You know how they are. So, but just one thing that may be of interest to the audience here. In our Constitution, certain fundamental rights are given to citizens. Equality is to all persons, citizen and non-citizen. Article 21, guarantee of personal liberty, citizen and non-citizen. So this is one thing I thought when you said link with citizenship, maybe it was on a different plane, but I wanted to point that out. Constitution makes not citizenship is not the only ground, it's not the basis for discrimination. Any person, even a non-citizen, can complain of discrimination. Now may I request Professor Jodhka to give his impressions of the book and what has preceded before that in the comments and discussion.
I'll try not to repeat what Dipankar has said. Thank you very much for having me here. I think it should not be called omnibus. It cannot be called what you were saying. It should be called collected
Magnum
work,
opus.
magnum opus. It should be called Andre Beteille Collected Work Volume 1 or Selected Work Volume 1, because magnum opus means 10 times bigger than this. So he's written so much. And I think I'll try to be more specific in my comments. I think one could perhaps classify Professor Beteille's writings into three categories. First are proper scholarly professional writings which are based on some kind of field work or serious engagement with kind of theory or Western theory, Indian kind of context. Second are his popular articles which are published in newspapers, occasionally even now. I think now he publishes only in Telegraph, not in Times of India, so we don't get to read them so much. But we have grown on that diet, as Dipankar said. And the third are what perhaps Professor Beteille would not like the classification as quote unquote policy relevant writings, the kind of writings that Chair was mentioning or Dipankar mentioned. Question of equality is a policy question, and these are all kind of question of dealing with backward classes is a policy question. I think it's very actively engaged with policy, even though this is a word that he writes in the introduction used to irritate him initially, but I think he's been one of the foremost sociologists who has engaged with contemporary times, engaged with the state, engaged with issues of policy and kind of practical kind of concern. I would try to deal with the first book again, which I reread, like revisiting a village. It was kind of revisiting the book and revisiting the village that he studied. And I think it's been historically a very important work in the history of Indian social sciences for sociology and social anthropology for various reasons. As Professor Beteille himself says, that he wanted to bring in sociological perspective, and therefore he started with the Weberian notion of caste, class and power. I think it's more than that. though it has been always packaged as a village study. I mean, there were village studies done by anthropologists, social anthropologists in 40s, 50s, up to 60s. This was perhaps one of the last village studies in that tradition. But I think it is not really a village study in the sense in which social anthropologists have studied the village. I think it is the first empirical sociological monograph that has been produced in India. Why do I say that? Because Professor Beteille is actually not studying the village. He's studying the region living in the village. And his book, if you read throughout, he's talking about Tamil Nadu. He's talking about caste. He's talking about agrarian classes. He's talking about relationships which are not about the village, which are general in nature. I think that's where perhaps anthropological monographs and sociological monographs should kind of differ. So if you read the book, it tells you about the regional context of caste relations, regional context of class relations, regional context of power relations, and I think anybody who wants to understand Tamil Nadu, South India, and by extension perhaps also rest of India, this is a very good case study which represents a region. I think Northwest India would be very different where I did my field work, but because in Northwest India, Brahmin have never been landlords, right? Brahmins have only been petty landowners, and they have never therefore carried that kind of status in the village society. So the caste structure varies from one region to another region, but for that region it's a study of the region and not study of the village. Second problem I have with the way it has been packaged as village studies, I think it's kind of, you have two phases in the study of rural India. First is the village studies phase where people were studying tradition and culture, caste, kinship, religion, as they were reproduced in a micro setting called village. And that was the tradition of village studies in 50s and 60s. I think Professor Beteille doesn't do that. Professor Beteille doesn't study village. I think it's more, after that you have a tradition of doing agrarian studies. Actually, I mean, if I read the three main chapters in the book, first is on caste relations, and the other one is on class relations, and the third one on power relations. I think the caste relation is something in which Professor Beteille is really least committed. If you read his literature, his chapter on class and power, he seems much more actively engaged, and this is something which perhaps was interesting him much more. He describes in detail about Brahmins and Agraharam and Cheri and the relationship between Adi Dravidas, non-Brahmins and Brahmins, three categories, as caste categories. But I think even there he's talking more about the changing context rather than. So I think this book needs to be, in a sense, revisited as a study of Indian society and more in the tradition of agrarian studies rather than in the village studies. If you read his later work on agrarian class structure, it in a sense stems very easily from the chapter on agrarian class relations. And what is he talking about in agrarian class relations? The kind of things he's talking about is Brahmins are leaving village and the land ownership is changing. Remittance economy and the relationship between non-Brahmins and Brahmins. Brahmins are already becoming absentee landlords. As Dipankar said, this is something that we started reporting from different parts of India only in the 80s, and he had already kind of indicated to it in late 60s because Brahmins had left. So this is something that was to come, but he could easily see the pattern, and that's why I feel this is a very important kind of work on understanding the agrarian change. It's kind of a historical archive. If we have to write history of contemporary India, this is something that every historian must read because there's so much, micro details literature on the changes taking place. The final point I would make is, I think all through the book, what Professor Beteille is doing is, I think he's studying power relations. And caste and class are two different dimensions of power relations. I'll just read 2-3 sentences from the book and then I'll finally conclude. He says, up to 1940s, the Brahmins enjoyed a great measure of power in the village. Their power was based upon ownership of land, high social and ritual status, and superior education. Numerical strength had not become a decisive factor. So it happens with the panchayats and then things begin to change. And what was this power? I'll not read the whole thing. There's just one sentence. I had actually marked out several pages, but I'll just read one sentence. In other ways, the Brahmins were often dependent on non-Brahmin for dealing with Adi Dravidas. When an Adi Dravida misbehaved, a Brahmin, Mirsadar, might ask his non-Brahmin tenant to fetch the miscreant from the cherry, tie him to a tree, and give him a beating. So I think these are very, very important statements in the sense that all through he's talking about the village and caste relations without the burden of Orientalism. I think by 60s, Dumont's and Poco's writing had already started coming out. By 80s, we were burdened by Dumont. We could not talk about caste without talking about homo hierarchicus, and as Dipankar was saying, trying to understand what exactly he's trying to say, trying to understand the whole debate between priest and the king, who is more powerful. I think this village, just 3 sentences make the whole question redundant. Brahmin is Brahmin because Brahmin owns land. Ritual status is additional dimension of his status, and the power he holds in the villages because of kind of traditional. I think that is where and that's how Professor Beteille has been so accessible to us, because he's dealing with things here and now. Not that he doesn't read people like Bourdieu or Foucault or earlier Dumont and others, but I think he speaks to us. And that's something which I have also kind of learned from him right from day one. Every time I read him, one felt inspired that if one has to become a sociologist, one should try to write like Andre Beteille. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your perspective on Professor Beteille's works. And now may I request Professor Nandini Sundar
Thank you.
to say a few words about the book and about the preceding discussion.
Okay. The previous speakers, in sort of partly complaining about Professor Beteille, I have 3 complaints in particular to prefer against him.
Complainants, who's the defendant then? Okay.
You are my counsel.
And the complaints of the pepper.
Yes, please.
One is that, as Dipankar said, we all started being utopian and many of us Marxist, and then he's forcing us to be Weberian and conservative because of the sheer lucidity of his style, the persuasiveness of his arguments, and the sort of the inescapable weight of the analysis. So one, he's made many of us more conservative than when we started off, or more realistic, or whatever. So I think that's something that he has to answer for, sort of stopping the tide of world revolution in India. The second is that he said it all before, and he's not even outdated. So when you try and work on a new area in stratification, you find that actually there's nothing new that you're saying because it's all been said much better. And it's not even outdated, so you can't even build upon it in a contemporary fashion. So, that's another problem. The third problem is that he says he's always castigating other people for being activists and for trying to influence public opinion. But he's one of the most influential voices in public life today. And who else would have a film like Arakshan, for instance, which agrees with his views about universality being the main issue and reservation really being besides the point. And I think it's a great triumph for Professor Beteille that it's becoming a view that is widely shared when it wasn't something that might have been acceptable before. And if you look at today's, well, since I haven't read the judgment, I can only quote the Indian Express, but they quote from the Supreme Court judgment today on the 10% reservation for OBCs. And this sounds completely as if it's, they've been reading Professor Beteille and have probably used inverted commas.
They have the book. They have the book in the judge's library.
Because this point that he's consistently made about the needs of institutions and how equality can has also to be weighed against that. And they say the minimum eligibility or qualifying marks cannot be lowered further than the current 10% because this would lead to a, quote, large disparity with the general candidates, thus affecting the excellence of higher education, unquote. Right, so the very notion that in a debate, in a judgment about reservation, you also raise the question of what constitutes excellence in higher education, the ways to achieve it, think about that as a serious problem that needs to be weighed alongside the rights of other candidates, in different categories is, I think, something that is certainly a product of the long years of writing that Professor Beteille has put before all of us. So, having said that, having complained about him so bitterly, let me say how much I've learned from him over the years and how impossible it is to sort of think about the subject of social stratification without referring to his writings, engaging with them, whether to agree with him or to disagree with him. And recently, we've been revising the BA sociology courses for the new semester system. And it's, what we really need to do is take Professor Beteille out of the syllabus because he's all over the place. And, in a way, you could have an entire stratification paper which is just based on his writings. It will be contemporary. It will be, cover a whole variety of themes. And so, since it cannot be reduced to, Andre Beteille equals stratification or stratification equals Andre Beteille, we have to actually take him out. So I want to sort of dwell on two particular essays. Since people have talked about the first book, I'm not going to talk about that. Though as Surinder said, it's something that at a point when people were not discussing this, he was able to see the future in what was happening then. It's sort of a tradition of sociology, which is like Marx, Weber, Durkheim, writing at the end of the 19th century, able to see the shape of capitalism as it was coming, rather than, like most anthropologists, recording the present. And I think that is something that is extremely important in Professor Beteille's work. But two other things that I want to highlight or sort of discuss is, one is his essay on harmonic and disharmonic systems, which he referred to in terms of the contradiction between equality, which is coded in the Constitution, and the inequality that we see around us. And he uses this essay to look not just at the caste system in India, but at feudalism in Europe and democracy in America, and argues that both in America and in India, while you have official equality, you have unofficial, in practice, you have a great deal of inequality. Now, I just want to sort of put it to Professor Beteille, since where else will I get a public audience to, have me disagree with him, is that, in fact, our official practice of equality is not, our official creed is not equality. The Constitution is not, is only a minor part in the way that it is regarded, or it is accepted or practiced by the country. And it is really capitalism, say, which is the ruling ideology, and it is that which is providing the ideological basis for inequality, and people accept that as inequality as much as they accept the constitutional equality that we have. So on the one hand, you have the Constitution preaching equality, you have equally strong ideological systems which people do accept in their everyday lives, also preaching inequality. So I'm not sure that there's a disharmony there between official ideology and the practice of inequality. But having said that, I want to point to another essay which I completely agree with this time, and I think is, again, one of those essays which was way before its time, which is especially relevant today, given this whole debate about Anna Hazare, and this is called The Public as a Social Category, and in this he talks about the way in which the public is constituted vis-a-vis citizenship, and this is something that Dipankar also mentioned, and to what extent that public is then driven by ties of community or caste, etc. And those very associations which are based on caste or community, etc., have now begun to be seen as constituting the public. And what happens when you have a public which is itself internally needs to be studied further in terms of what it's expressing as a feature of universality and democracy. So I'll just stop at that, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Beteille, would you like to take questions and answer all?
I think so, yes.
I think before, he has quite a lot to answer with all these complaints and different perspectives. But I think if you can put questions, he'll take it all together and comprehensively answer them. Please identify yourself. Come here. You can have the mic. Here, there you are. There's a seat for you next to Indra Malhotra. Put your question or comment and please identify yourself. Better. Mic chalo. Please sit down. Sit down. Be comfortable. Relax. We're all equal here.
Indeed. Universally.
Okay, thank you for the great lectures. I just have a question to the Punjabi guy. What are sorry, Sardarji. What are the sorry, I shouldn't address you like that.
You haven't identified yourself.
My name is Dia and I'm from University of Toronto in Toronto, and I'm studying religion, and I'm here on a holiday, and I just enjoyed the lectures. I just want to know how we can improve the situation of what are the things we can do to improve the situation in the Panchayati Raj.
All right, any other question? Any other question? Please come forward, take the mic. I think you can hear me. No, others won't be able to hear you. Please take it.
Come on. Keep sitting. Questioner's table. Chair.
My name is Rudrangshu Mukherjee. I work for a newspaper for which Andre Beteille writes, namely the Telegraph. You know, I'm a non-sociologist, as you know very well, but nonetheless your admirer. And I've always found your voice to be one of a skeptic, indeed often of intellectual heresy. And nothing illustrates that you're arguing against the grain all the time than the essay that went unmentioned by your three commentators, the absolutely marvelous tearing apart, I would say, of Amartya Sen's idea of equality, which is included in this book. But having said that, and having identified you as a kind of heretic, he's just a Bengali who pretends to write on everything.
Same subcaste as you, Dipankar.
So, now the question I wanted to ask you, hearing my three friends speak, I had the distinct impression, again as a non-sociologist, that Andre Beteille has become very much the dominant discourse of Indian sociology. Does that worry you?
He'll answer that.
Good question.
Bhaviskar, and I'm an old student of Professor Beteille's. And over the years, since Nandini raised the issue of complaints, I've of course learned, tremendous amounts from you. But one thing that I have always found sticky about your work is your consistent opposition to identity politics. And if the idiom in which people pursue the quest for greater equality is through the medium of a particular identity as Adivasis or Dalits or women, etc., one would think that there is something there that cannot just be dismissed as either a form of false consciousness or something which is empirically too problematic to be taken seriously. So I know that you've had this position over the years, but I wondered whether you have thought about revising it, given that these sorts of identities are with us today as social facts.
There's several very important questions that have come up, and I think Amita's question, Amita introduced herself as my former student. I may add that her father was also my student before her. That's a very important question, Amita, and I don't know that I have an answer to it, and certainly an answer that will satisfy you. You see, for the sociologist, the study of norms and values is central to his work. A sociologist cannot study a human society in the way in which a geologist studies the Earth's structure or an astronomer studies the movement of the planets. When a sociologist is studying societies, he is studying norms and values. That is of central importance. But I make a distinction. It's a very difficult distinction. Before you leave, Soli, I would invoke the authority of Hans Kelsen, one of the great jurists, Hans Kelsen made a distinction between norms in the descriptive sense and norms in the prescriptive sense. And I think that's a very, very important distinction. I have tried very hard to study norms not in the prescriptive sense, but in the descriptive sense. And if I'm studying a matrilineal society, I have to, it's my obligation to present before you the norms of matrilineal society, whether or not they are my norms. If I am studying Indian society today, of course I recognize the tremendous significance of identity politics. And I have made this point more than once, that I accept the fact that identity politics will be a part of any democratic political system. But what has perplexed me and made me very uneasy is that identity politics is crowding out all other politics. One of the main champions of identity politics in India today, in India's political system today, is the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and I can document this. Now, isn't this something worth pointing out, that people who began by making fun of caste and community and argued that the only significant reality and the only source of inequality and conflict is class, I have tried to bring to the attention of the public the paradoxes that are involved in our politics, and I will not deny it. I have a kind of ingrained antipathy towards identity politics. I have an ingrained. But I don't think that absolves me of the responsibility of pointing to the great significance of identity politics in Indian society. And if I have failed to do it, then that's a failure of execution rather than a failure of principle.
Yes,
Other questions?
there are no questions now.
Answer other questions also?
No, respond to what Dipankar said and what the other panelists said.
The one about
About
capitalist and the one that
Nandini's question is about capitalism. Yeah, but Rudrangshu had a different question about. Yes, Rudrangshu, you know my views on Professor Sen's work, and I have become more. We were friends in Calcutta.
The question was not about Professor Sen. You see what, as a skeptic and as I said, an intellectual heritage, that you have now become part of the dominant discourse of Indian society.
You see, yes. But I have become a part of the dominant discourse of Indian sociology at a time when sociology as a discipline and as a profession is disintegrating. I don't think that as an intellectual discipline and as a profession, it has a very long future. I don't think so. So what does it matter whether I become a part of the dominant discourse of that discipline or not? It's not going to last for very long.
Okay. Right. Would you like to...
People will be without jobs,
Would you like to give a response? Sorry, Dipankar, will you please take over?
you take the chair also.
No, you take this. Come.
May I please have you leave to go now, because there is a function there and the Pharaohs Zoroastrians are very, very keen.
Politics. She is saying
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Identity without politics.
Please, thank you very much.
But if they excommunicate you, we will welcome you.
I'll go to Andre Beteille for legal assistance.
Doesn't want
Bye-bye.
that to happen. That's why.
Well, I'm sorry to leave this. I'm sure it's going to be very stimulating, but there are others waiting. But good night. Thank you very much.
Where's the answer?
I think he's given me the name of the book. No, that's yours.
Is this a well-known?
Happy New Year.
Is well-known position?
Glasses.
Glasses. He has two microphones. All right.
I can hear better once I wear my glasses.
I think switch off the one, otherwise they create it, right?
Yeah.
I'm Nalini Jain, also from Delhi University until recently. No, this is a very layman's question. I mean, Andre and I have been lucky enough to have Andre as walking companion in the gardens, and I've learned a lot from him. But I didn't learn this from him, that sociology is a kind of a dying discipline, and what is behind this? This has come to me as a bit of a shock.
Let me try to give a quick response to this. Of course, that's a very exaggerated statement, but it's an exaggerated statement designed to draw attention to the fact that the organization of disciplines and the organization of professions is undergoing radical transformation in the modern world. If in 1850 I had gone to Oxford, which is a university where you studied, and told them that theology and classics and Latin and Greek were dying disciplines, people would be astonished. But I think that there are major changes coming about in the organization of knowledge and in the organization of the institutions of knowledge, and I will not be greatly surprised if disciplines like sociology and political science face the same fate which theology, classics, and other great disciplines in the 19th century faced with the reorganization of knowledge.
Yes, you have the mic.
Just going back to, I'm Viren Prakash, a former civil servant, and I've been reading some of what you have been writing with great interest. And I'm trying to go back to Professor Sundar's question, whether there was a question or not, but it seemed to me that there is a question, that this constitutional equality, as enshrined in the Constitution, is accepted very widely, except for some right-wingers who are antediluvian or something like that. Whereas this modern capitalism, almost American-style capitalism that is taking grip of India, is not really, is very antagonistic to that idea. So what does it imply in terms of sociology for tomorrow?
I think that since Dipankar referred to the work of T.H. Marshall, I will refer back to his work, his great work called Citizenship and Social Class. I think that Marshall drew attention to a contradictory tendency in Western societies. He believed that on the one hand, the development of economic arrangements would increase the inequalities of class. On the other hand, the manner in which the political system was developing, and the inequalities of class are basically aspects of inequality. But he said that there is a countervailing tendency which comes up through the concept and the idea and the form of citizenship. So there is a constant dialectic between class and citizenship. Now, capitalism, I think that we'll have to consider quite seriously what we mean by capitalism and whether we have any brakes on capitalism. I don't think that anywhere in the world, and certainly not in India, people would agree in principle that capitalism does not need any regulation. In fact, our conduct of our economic affairs over the last 5 or 6 years has been widely praised by people in the United States, including Joe Stiglitz, widely praised precisely because we have sought to regulate the excesses of market capitalism. But what should we do in trying to regulate the excesses of market capitalism? Should we abolish altogether the process through which the free market moves ahead? What is the exact balance that we should try to achieve between regulation and allowing the market to develop is a question which is a delicate and difficult question. I don't think that one can give a blanket answer to that question.
You've had your turn. Is there anybody else?
Thank you, Andre. I just want a very simple question which is bothering me is how do you distinguish between human ecology and sociological ecology?
Sorry? Human ecology and sociological ecology. Yeah. Well, I think that's a question which Nandini will be able to, or Amita will be able to answer much better than me. No, Amita has done a lot. I don't really have an answer to that question. Among people in your field, Amita, do they make a distinction between human ecology and sociological ecology? Do they do? Professor Monga has been for a long time a professor of anthropology, physical anthropology in our own university. Would you like to address that question? I'm perplexed by the question.
I think we come out of different intellectual traditions, but we can probably take this up, talk about this.
You see, actually, human adaptability programs of then UNESCO have been concerned with this. And to my mind, only difference we can make is that human ecology is studied by anthropologists as a biocultural. They consider both the biocultural aspects of ecology, of the human. As we have studied in Burma or in Andes, Central Andes, at the different altitudes, how the body as well as the society adjusts. And in sociology, probably social ecology, you are considering only with the social aspects. But as an anthropologist, this is incomplete. Because human being is not only a member of a society. He's also a human being, he's also an animal. Maybe a different kind of animal. And he has to make adjustments. And he makes adjustments to his body. He's made it in Central Andes. He's made it in our Pangi Valley, in other places. And only because one small example.
Excuse me. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
We are short of time. I got your point. He's got the point. What's the question? Do you have a question? The question will be answered by Amita later on.
No, I think, I mean, if I may try very, very quickly. Professor Monga belongs to a tradition of anthropology which is based on the unity of physical and social and cultural anthropology. Therefore, for him, considering ecology as a problem only in the study of society limits our understanding of ecology. He would like to have a more comprehensive view of ecology, which does not limit it to society and culture, but considers the whole of man. That's probably true, but I wouldn't.
Gupta Mahajan from JNU. I'm of course inclined to begin by my Beteille because everyone has done that, but I'm going to resist that for a little while because I don't see him as a skeptic at all. But we've had discussions frequently on equality. A lot of the positions that you take, as well as your own positions in terms of what you did in the university at specific moments in time, etc., stem from a certain understanding of the space for the individual within the system and for a commitment to whatever you believe in and holding on to it in a consistent kind of way and going by that. And yet in your writing, this is a dimension for individual or liberty, because when you talk about this is present as an absent presence, but never as a direct presence. And I don't think it is explained sufficiently by saying you're interested in really explaining the norms and values by which a system operates. Because in the system you are really talking about has space for this. You want that space to be utilized, but you never really speak of it upfront. And just thinking, why? So the classic, dichotomy. Yeah. It's also the reference Berlin has in mind. I mean, there are so many references to this dimension, and I think your commitments stem very centrally from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that Isaiah Berlin led a very fruitful intellectual career, contributed a great deal to the understanding of human life and human thought. But I don't think that, on a much higher plane, and on a much larger scale, I don't think that Berlin's position was very different from the position that I adopt. I don't think so.
But you do it better. And I've always been exasperated by Berlin. Any more questions?
Good evening, Combe Carpentier. We met for the first time in 1977 at Delhi University, Professor Beteille. I am curious, what is your take on the civil society agitations which are taking place in many countries and in India now, of course, the Anna Hazare movement. Do you see it as some trade union and more traditional, you might say, social, structural organization see it as a sort of a manifestation of a middle-class uprising which essentially breaks out of constitutional frameworks and in a way leads to an outcome that cannot be predicted because by definition it is non-institutional, and therefore what is its representativeness? Thank you.
You've answered your question more or less. I think that the concept of civil society is problematic, and I think it is misused and abused in public discussions in India. I've written and published on this. The concept of civil society has two genealogies. The more popular genealogy is the genealogy that derives from Hegel, Marx, Gramsci. And in the writings of Hegel and Marx, civil society was the English translation for what they called bürgerliche Gesellschaft, which is bourgeois society. Bürgerliche Gesellschaft has been translated alternately as bourgeois society and civil society. It did not have a positive value in their writing. They were always ambivalent towards it. But there is an older tradition, which goes back to Adam Ferguson, the Scottish moral philosophers, whose idea of civil society was much closer to an idea that I find acceptable, that civil society consists of a set of institutions which provide the social basis for democracy. Democracy has a social side as well as a political side. It has political institutions and it has social institutions without which these political institutions will not be successful. And Alexis de Tocqueville talked about associations, the importance of associations and the importance of other kinds of mediating institutions between the citizen and the state. That's my conception of civil society. Whereas what passes for civil society are really social movements of a rather amorphous nature. And the class basis of those social movements have to be much more closely examined than has been the case so far. I don't know what will come out if we start examining the class basis of these social movements. But I do not regard these social movements as representing the universal voice of Indian society at all.
I'd like to intervene here for a minute. Yes, the two versions of civil society as you mentioned. There's a third version of civil society which is doing the rounds now, which is probably a Ford Foundation version of civil society. So I think we should be careful about that, because any activism of any kind is considered to be civil society, and that really goes up my nose because I think of Ferguson, Hegel, Marx, Gramsci, and I find that this understanding of civil society to be so superficial. But the other question, I don't think there's been any movement of any kind of any significance in the last 200 years or more which has not been middle class. There's not been a single movement. And very often what happens is when you want to smear a particular movement, you say it's a middle class movement, knowing jolly well that your movement was middle class too. I can't think of a single movement, honestly, the past 200 years. I haven't gone further down the road. I don't think there was middle class before 200 years anyway. But all movements, whether fascist, communist, whatever, Anna Hazare, Congress, Gandhian, every one of them have been led by the middle class, if not the elite. I think we've run the course and we're all very happy right now. So thank you very much. Good night. Thank you, Professor Beteille. Thank you very much.
Well, I just want to inform everyone that the program has been webcasted, and this will be available for future viewing on the IISc website.